So I mean, the big overarching project that I've been working as, been on marriage. Marriage is that central theme in the Bible, and it's really interesting how it um, really like it seems like when you start to understand the principles at play in a relationship like that, how much it affects everything else. Things like economics. Economics is well, now we have a sexual marketplace, or a dating economy. So, and that's always been a important aspect of that. So, but yeah, it's been interesting, and I've been brushing up a lot on Nietzsche because I definitely had the kind of cursory like he was really against Christianity, so don't read him.
Sure.
And so didn't, and and obviously you've pulled quite a lot of good stuff out of his writings and your work, and so the more that I dig into what he was saying, like I think he really was a prophet, and it just so happens that everything he says is worded as being against Christianity because the Christianity of his time was so awful.
Yeah, right.
So, like, I don't think he's like, it's funny. He's working the Antichrist. I think he's the anti-Antichrist. But really, I think, it is that lingering kind of pietistic morality that is the suppression of desire, which is not really, you're not really suppressing it, you're just pushing it, or you're suppressing it so that you can get it, in a sneaky way later on, if you do the right things. And, and I think that it's interesting because that also applies to like the economic sense, because you see people trying to figure out like what is the good advice for how to be responsible, like like a Christian author like Dave Ramsey or something talking about that stuff, and it's this kind of basic conservative plan. But then you see like, oh well, all other people that are doing all these other things a lot more, and it's not just, and the temptation, I guess would be a thing to look at it as like an indestructible map. The temptation would be to just say, oh, well, it looks like it's working for them right now, but it's, that's just because they're being deceived, and eventually things will come around. And like, well, if you think that, you are just, you're insisting on not learning what it is that's actually going on and what actually is making those new changes compelling to people. So yeah. So I mean, I don't know. I guess it's like to put it back in the thing, like everybody should write their own book and figure out their own philosophy for principle. At least you know that you will have a good grasp on the things that you have spent the time trying to learn.
Yeah, first off, it is very interesting how economics comes to be the kind of dominant metaphor. People like I.A. Richards, Postman, I can go on, many more, kind of emphasize that we make our metaphors and our metaphors make us. And really, metaphors are not just decorations of thought, they structure thought. And there is something to be said on if at the fundamental level, kind of on the kind of metaphysical foundations, a thing that has gotten us in trouble is that economics is the dominant metaphor versus marriage. So much so that actually marriage is thought in terms of economics. And really then fighting and trying to bring back what is marriage. Because I think we just think of it as a relationship, which of course it is. But there is a deeper ontological reality that is to be present there. And I think it often gets lost because we do have a metaphor of economics that has dominated the dating market, or even kind of what's fair in a market. I do this and you should do that. There's a kind of idea that a good marriage has equal exchange, that the workload is evenly distributed. And of course, there's some truth to that, but the economic emphasis dominates. And I think that says a lot to where we kind of end up. And I think there's a lot of issues with that. So there's something to be said. And Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. Anyway, what you were saying on Nietzsche there, Mrs. Sartori, Nietzsche is really interesting because there are, like, for example, these sections in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Owen in the Agon does good work on it as well, that actually you never hear about, like meeting the guy who killed God in Zarathustra. That's in there. There are all these little sections that don't really get discussed, that actually does, I think, suggest a much broader picture. I think what you were just saying there at the end, on this idea of basically going that one day, justice will reign. One day, the mistakes of their way will kind of come to pass, and how that actually removes incentive to understand other worldviews. This cannot be overstated. And in all honesty, a purpose of the map is indestructible is to suggest that that does not necessarily follow, that people can kind of stay in an indestructible map forever. And the key is, I don't deny that auto-cannibalism and bad consequence doesn't occur, but there's kind of an assumption that if it does occur, the person will know it's occurring and thus change. And that actually does not necessarily follow. Even if your internally consistent system is destroying you, there is no guarantee that you will actually realize that you need to change. In fact, you may just take that as evidence that other people are doing something wrong, right? So that's where you can get in an enclosure where kind of hell is locked from the inside. I would definitely associate that, for me, with bestowing. That I think the way to think about Nietzsche is a good way to think of him, based on book 5 of The Gay Science, is as a critique of bestowcentrism, where basically we have our values bestowed to us versus things that we choose and become. He doesn't just critique religion, he critiques science, he critiques pragmatism, nationalism, purpose, all of these as being ways that we give ourselves value that are bestowed externally versus intrinsically arrived at. And yeah, religion is just a really pressing example of that. But there is absolutely something about what you were describing. And again, I'm happy, any thoughts on anything. And Mr. Luber, if there's anything that you've been thinking about, I'd be curious. There is something about deus ex machina, if you will, like that one day the truth will be unveiled, that actually is waiting for Godot and thus waiting for bestowing. I think this really ruins many people's lives because it removes initiative. Like, it removes the reason to act or to learn, right? You have no motivation because you're basically like, one day the cards will fall, one day things will unveil the truth. And then you just kind of passively sit back and you don't learn where they're coming from, nor do you, for example, like step in and repair a friendship or a relationship or something like that, right? Like, you're really become incredibly, incredibly passive. So I think there's a lot there. But Mr. Sartori, if you have any additional thoughts, I'll throw it back to you, sir.
Well, one of the things that I kind of had an epiphany is because, the whole indestructible map thing is so key to all this, because it's just the progression of culture is blowing up these systems, and usually in a painful way, because people are so reluctant to let go of the things that are, giving their life structure and meaning, obviously. But kind of one of the things that I kind of came to is that, like, that whole mechanism of that internally consistent system, like, it seems like the right scale, or like the perfect scale, is for a marriage, and I'd say a family. And that that's our ability to craft those systems is the way where you and your spouse create your own internally consistent system. And, and obviously it should be open to the extent, that's why I said, it's not, you realize that it's limited to that sphere, and that once your children take what they've learned out into the world, they're going to encounter different forms of that, but that is the scale that it really shines in, like, maximally. And then really, because, it makes sense, even because if you think about it, like the Bible even has this kind of like royal language, like a royal priesthood and all this stuff. And everybody thinks of like, well, how can, if everybody's a king, then nobody's a king. But that's not really true, because it depends on the scale of the unit, and the proper scale is your, nuclear family or whatever. Really, I think that, and I think that it is even almost at a scale where it becomes problematic if you try to hold on to that more than one or two, generations in its, so if the grandfather remains the patriarch and then becomes, or the great grandfather, which is how the Roman system works, that, the oldest male remained the patriarch until he died. And that's more problem. And that has that same mechanism that slave morality or whatever, because it's like everybody's living under this system saying, I hate being under these rules, but I know that someday I will be the one in charge. And so I'm going to put up with it, and I'm going to reinforce it, because I'm going to get my day at the top. And then, of course, once you get to the top, they live as a tyrant, and the pattern continues. So
I think there is absolutely something about a marriage or a family that is an internally consistent, because you have to have a map. You have to have an internally consistent system. Otherwise, you're irrational, right? The question is, do you acknowledge the girdle point? There is something about a marriage that perhaps, and I think this is correct, in a family, that is uniquely positioned in a person's life to be an internally consistent system where they encounter the girdle point. Because you realize that your ideas don't cover the fullness of your wife. And if you try to conform your children to your ideas, they hate you. And so you literally in the family are really very likely to encounter that the map is not the territory. Whereas if you go to church or on a more abstract scale, it's more likely that you can form an internally consistent system that does not acknowledge the girdle point, right? And you see, I think we just kind of almost anecdotally can know this is true, because I don't know if the majority, but I would wager the majority of traumas are family related. Most people's traumas are tied to their family or their marriages, or, well, trauma and mental illness go together with a lack of preparedness for the girdle point, where you respond to the girdle point by either trying to reassert the map to deny incompleteness, or the entire system falls apart because you can't hold it together with incompleteness, and that can lead to enclosures or withdrawal or pulling away, stuff like that, right? Many people's deepest pains are tied to family and marriages, which again can be an indication of precisely the fact that it is a place that is uniquely situated for people to encounter the reality. The map isn't the territory. But and then there's also, here's kind of the key. Most of the time in life, if you encounter a place where the map isn't the territory, you can exit. You can just kind of leave very easily by saying those people are wrong, and therefore deny that your map isn't the territory. You see, like when you encounter otherness that shows your map isn't the territory, if I just say, well, they're wrong, well, then the revelation my map isn't the territory goes away. I don't actually unveil that, right? Because I can exit. So exit is a way that you can maintain your internally consistent system, or denying, or, calling that person a dick or something, or getting rid of it, right? But in the family, you encounter, or a marriage, you encounter the map isn't the territory, and you can't leave, or you can't leave easily, and arguably that rightfully so, right? And this kind of is a little bit, there's a thinker, Zupancha, that kind of talks a little bit about this, but there's this idea that in a marriage, you encounter incompleteness, and you can't easily dismiss it. You have to kind of live with it. And if you have an entire education system, society, social imagination, church that basically has not been preparing people at all for this, then we should not be surprised if marriages fail. Because you see, marriages failing is not simply a matter of divorce. There are many people married who don't like each other, or they just kind of get by. There's a lack of thriving, right? So that's a very dominant thing, unfortunately, right? Well, that's all an indication of a lack of preparation for incompleteness, for for encountering the girdle point. People don't know what to do. And so basically, like, look at all these kids, leaving the parents, the estrangement. I think this is actually a very, not many people talk about it, but this, I think, is a lot behind the birth. I wouldn't claim this with any authority. Um, the birth rate crisis. Because people are scared because they don't want to encounter the trauma of family or having kids, and they know it's an unknown that they can't reverse, and they're scared. Because it's like there's almost like a rationality not to have a family or kids. Because in some respects, this is horrible to say, it's easier to leave a marriage without kids, right? But if you have kids and you find out the map isn't the territory and you're not ready for it, well, then that's a much bigger to do, right? And I think that is also part of it. And I'll throw it to you on any thoughts. But on this idea of kind of a kingship, like you're saying, I think it's 100% the case that what ends up happening is people have dealt with the girdle point of family structures with basically various bestowing deus ex machina structure. Well, one day I'll be in power. One day I'll be the CEO and everyone will listen. One day I'll have money and prove myself. Like, there's all these different kind of ways to basically cope with a non-thriving family situation. I think that happens all the time. Like, the family is not thriving, but there's various slave mentalities that are in play where people rationalize it and rather than face it. Like, they rationalize a day waiting for Godot when it's all going to be made right, which then if it is made right, you just perpetuate the power dynamic. That's exactly right. You just perpetuate that, right? So then even being made right is not actually being made right. It's just a Band-Aid, if you will. But that just perpetuates. And basically, there is something to be said, and I'll give to you on anything, Mr. Sartori. There is something to be said that if you don't properly face the map is indestructible, then you're going to end up in some sort of bestowing structure, some kind of slave morality or trauma, and then exit. It's almost slave morality or exit, like leaving. Like, those are the two options for most people. And neither one of them afford thriving. And I think there's a lot of that. But I'll throw it to you. Any thoughts?
Well, it's interesting because, I'd say, like, one of the things people will point to, and I can agree, like, the introduction of no-fault divorce, and I can agree that that's not a great thing to have. But, like, you'll see people saying, like, oh, it's the problem is that they instituted no-fault divorce. But what's more important is what it revealed, in the fact that as soon as it was available, so many people availed themselves of the opportunity to exit marriages. So it was showing you that those marriages were just, a great degree of them were just held together because of the social convention and all of the associated costs of exiting that made it more convenient to stay rather than leave. And it's like the same thing with, like, school prayer or something like that. Like, taking school prayer out of school didn't change anything. It just revealed something that was already going on. And I think the baby boomer generation is the great, in almost every instance, they are the ones, basically, that's what they just said. Why are we doing all these traditions that we have been doing for hundreds of years and thousands of years, and people didn't have answers? Now, I think we are also learning through experience why those things were there in the first place and what the real value of them is. But it is always better to say, to be prepared for something. You can't be prepared. Like, I remember, like, my grandmother, she divorced her first husband, and, like, the whole thing was, why did they get married? It was like, well, it was the thing to do. And it wasn't a good match. And then, like, they moved across the country, and he encountered the neighbor and thought that she was an upgrade, And so it's like, well, yeah, that sucks, but that's, and you can't get to the better results without the friction. So the goal is to build the friction into the systems. At the same time, too, I think family is one of those, and overcoming Gödel point things. Well, it's even, if you look at like the baby's development, even in the first year, like, every few weeks, months, there's these developmental leaps. And that's what, and it's like a total re-scrambling of the baby's brain, because it's like, first they're going off of like light and dark. And then they start noticing things like faces, and then like that objects are distinct or whatever, and all these things. And like, I guess it's through lots of observation that we can tell exactly what these persistent leaps are. But each time that happens, it's a complete overhaul of their entire worldview. And that happens all through childhood too. And, that's where it's like, the whole rebellious teen phase, like, people said that's not actually, like, the rebelliousness is not innate, but we had a rebellious phase because we had an arbitrary authority phase that they needed to rebel against. So so the point, I think, would be, if because it's kind of funny. It's like Rousseau didn't think that you should swaddle babies, and like, because it was like restrictive, and it's like, no, well, babies actually do need to be swaddled, like it helps them regulate their temperature and all this stuff. But there's something to that idea of like, well, yeah, too much restriction, or if they're not, like, you have to have the right restrictions for the right stages of development, and they have to be overcome, because if they're not, you have arrested development. So yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that goes along with those categories.
I'm very taken by the thought that what defines the teenager, the idea of a rebellious phase, might be overly reifying how teenagers are in the quote unquote third turning against the decadent generation. And it is very interesting to think that that kind of universalization or absolutism is just a reflection of a historic period, because I'll talk about the first turning, the visionaries, the second turning, the engineers, the third turning, the decadents, the fourth turning, the nihilists, and it all kind of repeats for Neil Howe and William Strauss. And I think it's a very useful model. And I do think in their original, and we've talked about it, their original book in the 90s, they make a very strong case. The popular books after that, talking about the fourth turning, perhaps not so much, but that original work, I think, is quite powerful. Because, yeah, there's this kind of way that generations tend to respond to the previous generation that creates a cycle. It's not a natural law, but it's probability. It's just how it tends to occur. And that is a very interesting idea. And I would wager that there's a lot of truth to that. Everything else you're saying there, I don't think can be overstressed. I'll talk about Hegel, and, Hegel, who I think it is incorrect to stress him as this kind of simplistic, progressive, rational thinker, where, history is a story of gaining rationality and so on and so forth, and we're improving all the time. Well, the key is that the way that rationality occurs is by making mistakes and hitting limits and friction. The key is to understand that the gaining of rationality for him is a process of rationality doing something stupid that it couldn't know was stupid until it did it. So it's a kind of a very unprogressive progress, if you will. It's a very comic sort of, there are necessary limits, right? And if you don't have those limits, you can't develop. And I really like what you were saying about how no-fault divorce actually unveiled something. And that is a good example of how Hegel thinks about history, where there is you could say a rational advancement, right? You could argue that there's this kind of idea that, okay, well, why do you need law to support marriage, right? And Mr. Luber, we're now talking about Hegel and history and limits and stuff. So there's this idea that, okay, no-fault divorce, that's a bad thing because it made it easy for people to leave marriage. But then the ease of people leaving marriage unveiled something always beneath the surface that we needed to face, right? And actually kind of responded, like, maybe we're not doing marriage properly. Maybe we're not teaching people that marriage is about facing the Gödel point. It's the internally consistent system that if you don't learn to dwell in, you suffer auto-cannibalism versus beauty, right? And but you see, that example presents you a choice. 1, go back to removing no-fault divorce. 2, figure out how to thrive in marriage, right? so that even if you can leave easily, you don't, right? In a very real way, this is a small kind of micro example of what I'll call the absolute choice. And I think conservatives can have the tendency of basically saying, well, just get rid of no-fault divorce, right? But you didn't deal with the fundamental thing. The progressive may actually say, well, this is evidence that marriage is fundamentally corrupt and we shouldn't have it. Or actually, we should. What's the problem? Why is it so bad if people easily leave, right? You could have one of those two responses. Whereas kind of the Zupančić or perhaps lacking kind of view is, no, this is evidence of a kind of deeper reality we haven't taken seriously about the human subject, which is that we entail a kind of fundamental lack. We actually are very bad ourselves of knowing what we want, and it's only actually in the encountering of limit that marriage brings out that we can encounter the fullness of ourselves. And we've actually, most of history, been running from that, right? That third option is actually where I think all the real, true, new political, social, and economic thought is going to be found. And the more I listen, I'm happy to get into it, but I have been trying to listen and catch on these economists who are starting to acknowledge the shortcomings of liberalism, but also wanting to defend it. You know, this idea that it reminds me of Steve Pinker, and they're saying stuff like, well, we really need to acknowledge local communities and their values and not kind of ignore them in light of globalization. And then somebody says something along the lines of, but, we still need to defend women's rights and make sure they don't teach creationism or something. And they go, well, of course. And I just want to scream. I'm like, that is the problem. You can't just say, it's so obvious. We need to acknowledge people's beliefs. And Clayton, good to see you. You need to acknowledge people's belief and respect their local communities, not absorb them in a giant techno-capitalist monolith. But we better not let them teach creationism, and we better not let them, think that gay marriage is bad or something like that. Well, then you're screwed. Yeah, what are you talking about? But there's always this self-evidentness that doesn't have to be explained when some of the more quote unquote liberalist or Enlightenment people are talking. Well, of course, the state needs to step in then. And it's just okay, so what about CRISPR? What about animal rights when it's murder, right? Like the ethical real. And it's just, to me, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, because when I listen to the Nobel Prize winning people talk about this, it's really interesting how it's really interesting how I think many of the best thinkers within institutions who are not on ground zero don't realize how naive that sounds. And how it's did you get the 2016 memo? Did you get any of those memos? Because it is precisely those issues that are evidently obvious we can't allow. The communities can do whatever they want, just not these. Those are the ones they care most about. So they're not going to accept it. I'm sorry. Anyway, really, the grounds here, Mrs. Sartori, please.
Well, I wanted to, as you were speaking earlier, I remembered that I was studying. It was very interesting about the idea, more so, especially of the idea of wanting to go back or whatever. Because it says in the Torah that if divorce is permitted, but if you divorce and you remarry and your former spouse remarries, even if your new wife dies and her new husband dies, you cannot remarry your first wife. You cannot go back to that covenant. It's this is an abominable thing to the Lord. And it's interesting because if you stay in the marriage, you can commit adultery. You don't have to be bound to that person. You can do whatever you want. It is the thing that you and they can negotiate whatever you want. But what you're not allowed to do is blow it up, go try to find something better, and then decide, you know what, I preferred the thing I had before. Which is also kind of just think about the Garden of Eden. That's the thing. It's you can be in here, you can do whatever you want except for this one thing, and then once you do the one thing, you can't go back in. And that's and I see that in as very much the beginning of a pattern of many more movings forward and not to be looking back. Or if you look back, to do that, to gain wisdom to fix where you are now. Because the point is, if you got a divorce in your first marriage, then maybe the best thing you could do is to not get a divorce in your second marriage. That would be the best way that you could, say you've learned something. But really, and it's just how it to me, it seems like so many of these things are about the kind of epistemological framework that we absorb through family, especially for children, where it's like, okay, if divorce is unexpected, but at least if we know that the divorce is permanent, then that is something that we can stand on. But if the divorce isn't even permanent, then you have no foundation of like, what does it mean? Like anything is possible. And it's weird, and it's a nuanced thing, because I think today, I think that's not an uncommon thing for people to remarry their first spouse. And you could say, well, that is, if it's not supposed to be, maybe could say, well, that's a Jewish law, so they don't have to follow that. There's something there, but that's even to say, like, well, these are the people that are going to live by these rules. So then, we have you have a nation of people who are going to do their one particular thing, and God's really, it's not so much that he's wants everybody to do all these moral things, but that he wants those people to be consistent with the laws that he gave them, so that they can be a stable reference point for other nations too. So it's kind of a similar thing. So those are the thoughts I had, but whatever.
No, that's very, very interesting. It makes me think, if my interpretation of what Hegel is saying in the philosophy of right, which of course Hegel is saying many things, it can be entirely wrong, but one of the key things I do think he is stressing is he wants to replace thought experiments like Rousseau's State of Nature or Hobbes' State of Nature as being the basis for a political order. I would like to argue that he wants to replace it with the state of now. And he wants us to assume the now by which to think the political order. Because it's exactly what you're saying. If you argue basically or assume that there are presuppositions, like we did something wrong or we need to go back to something, then you get an infinite deconstruction. Like things deconstruct forever, right? And you don't, and because you don't know, well, maybe we did make a mistake. Maybe it did have a paradise state of nature. Maybe it was Hobbes, maybe. And so what ends up happening is you can't actually, well, in a very real sense, I think Hegel is saying you can't think. Like you actually can't begin thinking because you don't have a basis by which to think. And what I would like to argue is that he justifies assuming the state of now by basically, if I were to bring in Augustine and different thinkers, is nobody does anything, because he has this philosophy of right. Like there's something about history having the movement of rightness. Like people kind of have to do what they think is right. Like if you think it's wrong to play basketball a certain way, then you think it's right not to, you understand what I'm saying? Like if you think you should murder someone, you think it's right to murder them, right? Like wrongness is not a way that can motivate your actions. And basically also then there's a reason to assume the state of now, because if every single person collectively must be doing what they think is right or good to do, then the collective effect would mean that the now is probably more reflective of people in their particular experiences and knowledge going, hey, this is better than the alternative, so we should assume it, unless you think you're smarter than the collective consciousness of all of the history compounding up to this moment. Now, Hegel would not say that therefore they are right, they could be wrong, but you have to assume by which to think it, right? So you have to, and if you don't assume the state of now, then you're doomed, basically. And given in Aspasia, wonderful to see. And I think this applies to marriage as well. I think this applies to all relationships. Like if you don't assume that the now, the current state in your relationship, there's good reason it got here, or there's a good reason that history got there, you can't begin thinking, all you'll do in the relationship is blame. That's not thinking. It was your fault. Oh, I remember this is what you did. Oh, they did this wrong. Or conservatives will say liberals got it wrong or technology did it. What ends up happening is if you don't assume the state of now, it's just a blame game. Just those stupid liberals killed us all. Or like Trump, all the Republicans talking about Democrats. They're why America's messed up, right? But if you assume the now and instead say, no, there's good reason we got here. And basically what Hegel wants to say is that you would have In all likelihood, what got us to this current place we're in history, if you were in the past, you would have made the same decisions to get here too, right? Like when people talk about the problems of technology, you always want to emphasize to them how effing difficult it was to get clean water, or how difficult it was to travel, like, or just the miracles of the internet, for goodness sakes, right? Like, you know, there's people in the past who didn't have said things for good reason went in this direction, right? Same with liberalism and all the people confronting like post-liberalism, or if they want to talk about, like, I've been obviously listening to everyone talk about the end of the unipolar moment because of what's going on in Iran and the Japanese yen market and all these other things that are beyond, they are of extraordinary importance as far as I can tell. But anyway, and there's this kind of idea that the unipolar moment or hegemony was a mistake. There was good reason it happened. It was darn good reason it happened. Like, because when you don't have it, you get infinite war. And so basically, I think what you're pointing at, it's interesting to think of what you're saying with the Torah as basically you must assume the now. You cannot go back. And what would it mean? Like, for example, what would it mean? Like if both political parties or marriages or relationships, and I'll throw it to anyone who wants to speak on anything, don't assume the now. Because here's the other issue. Like if you don't, yeah, exactly. If you don't assume the now, another thing that Hegel, I think, is suggesting is you actually never encounter limit. Like you never run up into limit. Because what you're saying is that, no, that previous conservative account or way that our marriage was not limited. It's that we left it behind, actually. So you're actually kind of positing something as being unlimited in a certain way, right? We just need to go back to that. Right? You're not seeing the limitedness in that previous account or that previous way of doing things. That's why you're longing to go back, right? So what can actually happen is a longing to go back can be an avoidance of limit. But of course you would say, but no, wait, if you want to go back, aren't you saying that this present moment is limited? No, you're not. Yeah, you are. You're saying it's insufficient, but you're not really encountering the limits of it, because you're not seeing that this moment is actually on a continuum with the past you want to go back to, right? You're thinking if you go back, you'll avoid the present moment. Hegel is like, no, you'll come right back to the same present moment. You'll go back and this will repeat in 50 years, actually, and you'll just get stuck in a loop 1,000 times, right? And I'll throw it to Clayton here. The same thing happens in marriages. There's kind of this idea that when you blame someone or say, if you would change or if you would have done this, things would go good, then actually what ends up happening is you don't encounter the limits of yourself brought out in the relationship that you need to face to bring the relationship to the next level. You just go back, and then it's only a matter of time before that thing happens again, and you're not prepared for it. And so that movement of history that I think Hegel is suggesting is absolutely isomorphic with what happens in marriages, in relationships, time and time again. And instead of trying to go back, you assume the now. You assume that everyone in the marriage got to this current, problem for good reason. That the wife was doing what she thought was good, that the husband was thinking they were good. Too bad we're just really bad at knowing what's good, or we're stuck in our enclosures and hermeneutics, and that you must encounter the tension. Like you were saying, you must encounter the tension. Like you must, to advance, encounter the tension. And so then when that tension is encountered, the question is, are the people in the relationships able to face it and talk through it and be glad in it ultimately, because it unveiled a sublation, a transformation that couldn't have been met if you didn't so encounter the limit. But that goes against what is natural for us. But let me give it to Clayton here. Clayton, please. And it's good to see you today, sir. Thank you for coming by.
Morning, Aspasia. Me and you know what it is like right now. Yeah. Anyways, one thing that I want to touch on that you guys have been discussing is more like, what right is all about. And I feel like it's so easy to mix up. And we always compare right with wrongness. But I think that in itself is a conflation, because to me, I see them as, it's more like it's a two-step thing. So you have the being, non-being problem, right? Like, and like you said, like in the continuum of being, you can either be or not be. So there were those who successfully became and those who were unsuccessful at becoming. And those who became have always been, so they are being. And you could say that those who have continuously participated in the process or in the activity of being are right. And that is what right is really about. It's about being and existing. So if you are, then you are right. If you are not, then we know exactly that you are not right. And so you can either be right or not be right. Even within the continuum of being right, you're going to have some who are more right than others. And you're going to have others who are less right. So it's more like on a scale, it's on a sliding scale. So, but within the realm of being right or more right or less right, you can be correct and you can be wrong. So you can be correctly right and you can be wrongly right. You know, to use your analogy of the map, you'd say that the map, you know, the territory that has been mapped is right. And you could say the unmapped territory is not right. So where you place yourself on that map, if you decide to, you know, wander off into the unmapped territory, then you are being wrong. But if you wander onto the mapped territory, then you are being correct. And so, so then it kind of like puts a triple effect to it. So like, that's when it sort of like starts being confusing because if you are like, we're all trying to aspire to be correct and right. We don't want to be wrongfully right because wrongful rightness has dire consequences. And so, you know, I guess like all these laws are sort of trying to sort of like protect against wrongful rightness. And you'd say the realm of wrongful rightness, like aspiring to wrongful rightness, that could essentially be evil. It's like, yeah, the dark forest, or, you know, like the unmapped territory where rules of being right do not really apply or have been inverted. And so that changes the dynamics. So I thought like maybe framing it that way may give us sort of like another angle in which to play with. Yeah, I'll throw it back. Thanks.
No, magnificent. And I would certainly say that when I look at Hegel and his understanding of movement of history, and again, as I understand Hegel, which is, I certainly will not stress with any major authority, but as I understand Hegel, there is a certain idea that the movement of phenomenology, the movement of history, and the movement of the subject are all isomorphic, that they all actually kind of have the same structure. And because it's isomorphic, there would be reason to think there is some absolute idealism, if you will, perhaps metaphysics as such, as we were discussing last week, that is actually in play, that is being unveiled. And there's absolutely something where Hegel, and I'll give it to Mr. Sartori here, Hegel wants us to basically understand that there is always an underlying kind of dimension of right. Like you're saying, being and rightness go together. Like it's rightness that's going. And so what that means is basically if you play the game of not assuming the state of now versus the state of nature, then what's going to happen is you're going to basically you're going to suggest that rightness is not at play, and you're just going to go back and repeat the same thing over and over again. And it will be, and you're not, it's just going to be a spurious infinity. It's not going to be a true infinity because you're not ultimately accepting the ground of the state of now. And furthermore, Hegel would want to suggest is we must, and again, I associate this with Augustine, is that we must be motivated by a good intention. We cannot be motivated by something we think is bad. If we think we ought to steal something, we think it's good to steal it. And so there's a certain way in which it's almost like rightness as the necessary motivation of human action is a kind of determinism in a certain way. Now, Hegel's obsessed with freedom, though. So what are you going to do there? Well, this is why our freedom comes, is that rightness, according to the map, must eventually encounter where it is not the territory, where it runs up against something. And in that limit, that is where you could say correctness occurs. That is the question of what is the subject going to do. But the freedom is not actually going to emerge except in that encounter with limit, which then he warns we have the temptation to say that means we did something wrong, actually. That means we need to go back. So then we actually disavow that opportunity for freedom precisely because we associate the experience of freedom with a mistake. And then therefore we blame the Democrats or the conservatives or whoever who made us encounter that limit. We say they're in the wrong because they must be, because they made us encounter this. But this would also mean that actually, in a very real way, for the conservative, the liberal is their opportunity for freedom. The atheist is the opportunity of freedom for the Christian, and vice versa, because that is the encounter of the limit where you actually then, you had to have acted in a manner that got you there. And basically also Hegel wants us to assume the state of now, because if not, you'll assume that you made a mistake. But if you have to assume the state of now, then when you encounter that limit, you have to assume that it's right to be here. It's right to be at the limit of rightness. It's right to be here where the map runs into a limit. But that doesn't mean you did something incorrect. That would depend on what occurs then. But I think that everything you were getting at there, Clayton, is very important. But let me pause and throw it to Mr. Sartori here. Mr. Sartori.
Yeah, the thought that popped into my head when Clayton was speaking was like, oh, this is really interesting because of that scale thing, about the proper scale of your map. Because if you're making a map of a broader culture, or whatever, anything in the world, then it's an act of discovery. And so you are discovering, you're trying to anticipate, what the territory is by mapping it out. But there's the discovery of what it actually is, which means your map can be wrong. But when you get down to the scale of a marriage and you have two people, there's certainly a sense of discovery, on the part of each individual. Each individual is discovering, you should be writing a new map every day in your marriage of what you think your spouse, your map of your spouse is always wrong. But within the marriage itself, you aren't actually discovering. You are discovering, but really you're actually creating. And in some sense, you're creating new territory, and you certainly are in the sense of new human beings. That's where they come from. They come from that specific context, and you are shaping them. But I was thinking about this in the sense of like, well, one thing, like, why does God allow the divorce? There's an interesting aspect of the law that everything has to be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. And so if you are in a marriage, you can establish anything that you agree on because you have 2 witnesses. But if you don't agree, no one else can really say anything about it. So in some sense, your marriage, you and your spouse determine, like, did somebody in this marriage sin? Only if both people agree that person sinned. And that, which means that you can offer unlimited grace, or whatever. You have your house rules in some sense with those things, and God doesn't violate that. And then obviously I think when it comes to every time you have to step outside your house, then things get more complicated. So that is where you get more normative aspects of what a marriage means will, inevitably come, because your marriage has to exist in a community of other marriages. So there are limits in the broader context, but it's kind of like it is just what the 2 people in there, what they decide is right. They're actually kind of creating it, and not in a way, if they decide,
No, I think that especially certainly comes out when you have children and you have to decide, like, this is when we're going to eat, and this when we're going to go to bed, and this is what they're going to study, and you're making decisions for your children that they may not like, but they need. And you also, though, don't have, like, it's not like you have some objective authority from some court by which you can say, well, this written on this tablet here says that ice cream night is Wednesday and only Wednesday. But you have to decide that, and you have to kind of stand in that. I think that experience of, like you're saying, there's a certain sort of, within the marriage, there's an idea of what is right. And I also want to say to that, well, there's a few things. Okay. And then if anyone has anything to say, first, Aspasi in the comments was saying that another factor of all this is people are so tired, right? You encounter limits and there's a kind of like tiredness. And it's just like, I can't keep doing this. This is where I think beauty is extremely important. Because when you encounter limits and you overcome these times of like a deep misunderstanding, beauty is an experience of gaining energy. Like, beauty gives you energy. And I think this perhaps beauty creates energy. And I don't know, in a world that lacks time energy, as McCarricker would say, or that the socioeconomic system, like, it's very funny that probably what we get all this time-saving technology. Peter Kreeft has made this point. Like, we have all this time-saving technology and we're working more than ever before. And people are like, AI is going to like save us from work. I'm not so sure. I do wonder if AI will actually just make us have like infinite work. It will be very interesting to say. But the point is that there's something about our age that makes people feel tired. And I think it's a tired mix, physical and existential. Basically, yeah, exactly, as we say. Basically, there's something about beauty that is the necessary source of energy in a world that is a burnout society, as Johan would put it. I think the other thing that I was going to say is there may be something about a marriage. I do think this is true. Marriages and friendships of that Aristotle quality that actually are uniquely positioned for character development and sanctification. Because some of the most, Aspasi was mentioning resurrection. I'll give it to Clayton here. Some of the most important developmental experiences is when you do something that you're supposed to do, but everyone thinks you shouldn't, and in fact, they may see you as a bad person for doing it, right? So in a sense, you're doing what's correct, but it doesn't go with what's right. And I might be getting that language wrong, Clayton. Forgive me, but there's this idea that you're going against what's right. The being of the society, the map, right? And it's like Jesus, right? Like, he seems to be going against the right. He's the heretic. Like, it's just really important to emphasize that from the position of the Jewish leaders of the day, Jesus is a heretic. They're not wrong to crucify. There's a real way in which they're not wrong to crucify Jesus. He's a freaking heretic. But he appears a heretic. He's appearing a heretic because he's the fulfillment, right? So I actually think that key moments in people's lives are moments of appearing heretical that are actually fulfillment of something higher. And basically, I'm not sure if that possibility arises except when there's a break between the collective and more of the home, the individual. And there's something about a marriage where you can know that what the wife is doing or the husband is doing is correct, even though everyone sees it as wrong. And therefore, you can actually have an intimacy with them that nobody else can say, because you alone, as maybe their husband or their wife, can know that, oh my gosh, they're appearing heretical. And no one else will know that but you, that actually they're not a heretic, they're only appearing heretical. And that creates a certain intimacy and closeness and relationality that's not possible any other way. And that is only because, and that can happen in friendship too. And that is only possible, though, because of the relationality that has this private-public break, right? Unfortunately, most of the time, I'm afraid people use the public-private divide in order to act right, and then in private be very different, right? That actually they're appearing non-heretical, but in private they are a heretic, right? Is the exact reverse. When really the sanctification is appearing heretical in the social, in the right, but at home, it's actually fulfillment. But that's virtue. And that's a much harder undertaking. And I think it's more natural, dare if I say, in a sinful, fallen way. What is natural for human beings as fallen and sinful to do is in public, be right, do what is right for everyone. And at home, basically turns out that, you're just putting on a face, if you will. Whereas what Jesus shows is in public, you appear heretical. And that's actually for the 12 and intimately the fulfillment. That recipe, I think, that I'm describing, I'll give it to Clayton, that is an environment where a kind of intimacy is possible that's not possible in any other way. Like there's a quality of human relationality and love and respect and fulfillment that cannot happen in any other way. And if that is true, then it's basically only in marriage, family, or Aristotelian friendship that the fulfillment of the human being in this unique way is possible. But that means you're also facing the girdle point, and where the map is not the territory, and all of those tensions that are also a recipe for mental illness and trauma and deep, deep, deep hatred. Because it is only where the highest possible developments can occur that the deepest pains can occur. But that is the kind of risk necessary for, I want to say, a resurrection into new life. But let me pause and throw it to Clayton here, and then anyone else who wants to speak. Clayton, please.
Thanks, Daniel. I think you've beautifully brought it together, especially with the mapping language. And one thing I want to add to that is, to play on what Mr. Sartori was saying before. It's as though like if you're, and I think this ties into like what the sages are doing. Your Jesuses, your Buddhas, what everyone is like really trying to articulate in a very sophisticated way. It's like if you become, let's say, if you build a relationship with someone that is meant to kind of like merge those ways of being together. So it's like you're going to continue being alongside another person, and you guys are going to synchronize your continuous being, right? Then you somehow have to connect your maps, yeah? And now you have to collaborate in your exploration of this, of mapping out what the territory is and where the territory is not. And, like Sartori said, this is a continuous process because the two maps that are now working as one map are always being updated continuously. There's a new section that we are either extending on these maps, on this collected map, or removing from the collected map. It's we're sort of like tapping our ground to see, is there ground here? And we kind of like coordinate on that. And if there is ground, then we'll map it. And if there's no ground, then we'll map that there is no ground there. It's like, oh, it's not ground, it's a hole. And yesterday, someone almost slipped into it. So we should declare that this is a hole, so that as we continue to look for ground, it's more clear what the ground is and what the ground is not. But then it becomes very interesting when now you get like children, because now they are building maps, but within your maps, which are now combined, and they're dynamic, but those maps which are being built are also dynamic. And every time you guys decide where there is a hole or a lake or a river or a dark forest, that has a direct impact on the new maps of the children that are mapping. And so there's some inheritance there. It's like, especially I would enjoy this part because, that intergenerational trauma and all of that. It's like, yes, yeah, it has to work that way because, the parents mapped that part a certain way. So the children definitely have to inherit that mapping within their map. And so as they continue to explore, their maps are already shaped that way. You can't can't unshape the map you inherited because it was a big, you'd say, foundation for your mapping. Even the way you map has been pre-mapped that way. And so already that dynamic makes it quite complex. But this is before now we add other people's maps, right? It's like, your neighbors, your friends. I mean, those maps have to work together somehow. And then now, we can try to add in the community's map, right? Like, how is that working? How are we layering on that map? But then there's the state, and then there's the universe, then there's, the world, and it just like it's complexity upon complexity upon complexity upon complexity. And I guess that's where you need some sort of posture, some sort of way to sort of determine which place is a hole, which place is a dark forest, which place is a real ground. And as you do this, I guess you have to develop some kind of mechanism of managing this mapping, this continued exploratory mapping that's always going on at a daily rate. And so in my you'd say, the way I see it, I think like that is the birth of like religious practice, because for your map to be real, you must be like standing on it. And you have to actually believe it. You have to live in that map. You have to be there. Otherwise, if you're living in someone else's map, then do you even have a map? Like, what is it that you're standing on? Like, what is it that you stand for? Right? Do you even know what your map is? And so if you don't know which map you're standing in and which map, where you are, that just introduces a very sophisticated kind of worms. It's like, what are you talking about? And that's why, like, outside it may seem like heresy, right? It's like, what are they doing? And the only place that this can be reconciled is within, let's say, a combined map, like a relation, yeah? And that's where, like, within your interrelation, you can know because those maps are combined. And as those maps become combined, it validates the rightness of the spot of the map that you're holding. It's like this becomes more sophisticated than the correct wrong distinction, because it's like, no, this is about being here or not even being here. And so yeah, it just becomes over complexified. I just want to tease that out, because I think when we're sort of like trying to decide whether something is correct or not correct, we sort of like skim over the whole mapping complexity, right? And we sort of like think like, yeah, if we just go with whichever piece of ground somebody's standing on, it should be fine. But it's like, just because they're standing on it doesn't mean you should stand on it, right? And they can stand on it, but can you stand on it? Well, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So yeah, that's all the stuff. Okay. First, what you were just saying about a religion, 1,000,000%. Like, religion has this function of handling, I'm just going to say, the complexity. The compounding complexity is how our language. That's what religions did. What the sociologists all warned is that if you threw out religion, like you could say neoliberalism or post-World War II society basically tried to privatize religion. They said, okay, but in public, it's got to be secular. You keep religion in private. So basically what they all warned, and there's certain truth to that. There's a certain truth to the secular sphere. But the issue is, what they said is that means the public space will be unable to handle compound complexity, because the religions people leave at home are necessary for handling compound complexity. And if they leave it at home, then don't be surprised if the public square democracy goes to crap, which arguably it did. And so also the argument would be that, Mr. DeClerc, good to see you, is that religions, Well, before you came on, I was actually talking for a minute about listening to all the defenders of liberalism, talking about the need to take seriously people's private beliefs, because now you have this explosion of post-liberalism who's saying democracy failed, the end of the World War II consensus, and there's more and more like the Darren economist who won the Nobel Prize, basically saying that we need to respect people's local beliefs. We need to not be so elitist. We, if people are like Christians, for example, we need to be more respectful of that. But of course, we can't allow them to teach creationism in school. And of course, we can't allow them to support gay marriage. I just want to scream. I just want to scream because I'm like, those are the things people care about. Like, you can't see, that is what got us here, is we didn't have a way to deal with people's beliefs. And the other issue is that this is a larger conversation. But for example, if you say, okay, we want to have Christianity be plausible to people without creationism, okay? Let's just use that as an example. Then you have to do the intellectual work that shows creationism can be removed from Christianity and put evolution in it, and it stay orthodox. This is the key, that it stays true to its origin, not to your new. If it doesn't stay true to its origin, it's dead. Like it's going to lose its ability. It's going to lose the ability to handle compounding complexity. Okay, so what you have to do, and the issue is modernity did not provide ways to say, for example, the Christian, the Muslim, it's all the same. It did not provide ways so that the Christian could figure out how they could, for example, remove gay marriage or creationism from Christianity and keep it Christian, right? Instead, they said, you're just a bigot, but that's not the intellectual work. And you see, if you do that, then what happens is you make people choose between being accepted in secular society and losing their means of dealing with compounding complexity. That is the choice that everyone was forced to face starting in the 90s, basically. And around 2016, people said, screw you. I don't want to have to choose anymore between being in secular, polite society and what I need to handle compounding complexity, without which secular society, which is increasingly pluralistic, will kill us all. And so that is the effing problem. That is the $1 million problem, is that there has not been an appreciation of how religions are arguably the best psychosocial technologies by which to deal with compounding complexity that you especially need in pluralism, that pluralism says you can't bring into pluralism if we're dealing with democracy and secular society. And of course you say, well, no, we're going to change that. It's okay now. We understand our mistakes. We know, the 2016 election wasn't great. We're really sorry about all that. But so you can bring in your stories and your beliefs. Just don't bring in your bigotry against women or whatever. And I agree. Don't bring in your bigotry against women. But that's not it. You can't act as if it's self-evident to people that, for example, believing that marriage should be between a man and a woman is bigotry. Do you understand? And what many of the more kind of liberal academic sort of people would be like, they'll just say like, it's rational and self-evident. That's going to just repeat the 2016 and all of that over and over and over again. That will be incredibly intensified by economic pressures, right? You have to do the work of going into internally consistent system and engaging in what I call a neo-reading, where you can have a reading that incorporates new unexpected limits of the map that happen now, that maintains its authenticity and alignment with the origin. That is thinking. That is actually thinking. And I would actually kind of argue that basically is that's always what real, it's hard. That is always what thinking ultimately is. Like that's what you have to do in marriage. That's what you have to do in friendship. Like, how you learn to read is actually the exact intellectual operation that is necessary for friendship, for marriages, where you are able to incorporate something new without shattering the old, without shattering the internal consistency. But that is always necessarily in a girdle point, a point of incompleteness. But the girdle point turns out to be the point by which complexity enters the internal consistency, and dwelling in the girdle point means you are actually able to handle that introduction of complexity and see how it can align with the internal consistency and not abandon it. Because if you abandon it, you no longer have, for example, the religion needed for the compounding complexity. That is the $1 million freaking problem of our political system, of the global system right now, is that issue of neo-reading. The other thing I was going to say, and I'll give it to anyone who wants to speak on this fine day. So when you were talking about consistent becoming, Like you have to always becoming. The compounding complexity means that you always have to be becoming, right? My argument would be no one will maintain the energy requirements necessary to do that without beauty. The loss of beauty, if your system, your map does not have beauty, you will be naturally selected out. That is what I am arguing. That the global pluralistic world is of a level of complexity that requires psychological and existential energy demands, that the only maps that will not be psycho-selected out, almost like a new, I think natural selection is basically moved to the metaphysical level. It's moved to the ideological level. And the social coordination mechanism is basically creating the global interconnectivity of the meta environment will select out maps that don't have beauty. And so basically what ends up happening is we are just simply now in the age of selecting out all worldviews that are not beautiful because the energy demands will destroy them. And the question then becomes what worldview, what map, or what maps are able to generate the energy necessary to handle compounding complexity? Well, we don't know. Everyone has to make their wager. Is it Christianity? Is it atheism? Is it Christian atheism? Is it Christianity plus Orthodox? Is it, but what's your mixture? Feldenkrais plus Cray, like you have to have your mixture. Nobody knows, but we all have to make our bets. And there would be a pretty good reason to think the religions are probably a pretty good bet, seeing as they are the best psychotechnology for compounding complexity. I think also the key, you're doomed if you don't have a doctrine of forgiveness. You're doomed if you don't have a doctrine against gossip. You're doomed if you don't have a doctrine against judgmentalism. You're doomed if you don't have a doctrine that forces you to face otherness, because otherwise God's pissed. Like, you know, when God says you have to like love your neighbor, if you don't, if God doesn't say that, you probably won't when they piss you off, and you're damned. And so those things are important, but I'll give it to you, Clayton. But there's something about beauty that actually generates the energy without which you will be selected out, because the energy demands of the complex world are too high. But if you experience compounding complexity as an opportunity for beauty, which inspires you and creates you an energetic, then you're going to actually not be selected out by global pluralism. But increasingly, the collective subconscious unleashed by the internet and global interconnectivity puts energy demands on people that without beauty, you're doomed. But let me give it to you, Clayton.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, one thing I wanted to add to that is, you know, what we've been chatting in the chat as well. It's like all these, you'd say, religious postures, like I'm trying to find the right word. It's like they are ways. They are sort of like collations of some sort of like suggestions, I would say, of what may have worked for a certain group of people in a certain place. You know, it's like if you commit to it, it's like here's a model, here's an algorithm that could work. But I guess like we do take these things and over extend them. And it's like we sort of like overgeneralize, and we go like, well, they said it works, so why is it not working for me? It's like, duh, you're supposed to make your own. What are you talking about? Who said it was gonna work for you? The uniqueness that you bring into the realm of being means that you're in a very unique spot of being that no model has worked in other than you being in that spot of being. And unfortunately, what that calls is that, yeah, there is no algorithm for you. You are actually making it as you are being it. And so you have to write your own Bible. Yeah, you could take an open copy that's available, you know, take the Christian one, take the Buddhist or whatever, but then you're going to have to leave it in your place of being and customize it and adapt it for where you are. Because that was an example, you know, like, and those, you know, sacred texts they're very clear about this. You know, Jesus will say, no, I am showing you my way. Okay. And then kind of like it gets reiterated as the way, and then then become the slippery slope. But I think one helpful interpretation is like, it is a way and it works under certain conditions. You know, if you do science, you know, like, you know, I just love how in science, you start by declaring all your assumptions and what you're assuming is constant, which, the measure of that constancy. Not to say that it's going to remain constant, but it's like, as I make my proposition, here's the snapshot of the reality that I'm assuming. And whenever this snapshot changes, everything that I said changes. So be aware of that. Unfortunately, like, it's too, at a level of mapping, this is too sophisticated to kind of like you'd spend the whole time just declaring the changing constants, and you'll never even come to the algorithm you're trying to map out. And so it's very hard. And I think by skimming over that difficulty, over that complexity, and looking for some sort of relief, some sort of like, I don't want to create my own Bible and my own map. Why can't I just use something that's there? Like, why do I have to make it from scratch? Can't I just take what Aspasia does or what Daniel does, and can I just not do it from where I am? And the correct answer is like, no, you cannot. You have to go make your own. That's why they're there and you're here. But it's so frustrating. Like, why must I, why must I walk myself? Why must I decide what I eat? Why can't somebody choose that for me? It's like, because, well, you're you. You have to do it. That's your job, since you are you and you are being. So do it. And I think that's the tension. That's the challenge. It's like, do we want to do that? And I think what you're calling out, Daniel, is like, yeah, none of that's going to be possible if you can't even see beauty. Of course, like, you can't. Like, how can you? Right? Like, yeah, you'll be lost in the dark forest, and yeah, you'll have to deal with those consequences. Yeah, I think the critiques, like, really don't take the position of where they are seriously, and they are trying to dress in something that they have not created, and they should go create. Like, that is the job. It's like, go create your own, talk for that, and yeah, then you'll be fine. But if you're just gonna whinge about other people's creations, then that's not helpful. That's not helpful at all. Yeah, I'll pass it back. Thanks.
No, completely agree. And again, without beauty, you will not have the energy by which to handle compounding complexity. And you can argue, before you had an interconnected world of compounding complexity, then actually inheriting someone else's quote unquote map would practically function, because the energy demands was not so high. But you see and also too, the problem is, without the soil, Mr. Joachim, good to see you, sir. It's a pleasure. And we were actually the Friends of the Beautiful Conversations, everyone, you must listen to. And I really enjoyed the reading one. Those points that Javier was making, that you would say, that's actually really, really important. Without the social coordination mechanism, it could be argued that it was logistically too difficult. The transaction costs were too high, by which people could regularly and at critical mass engage with the creation of their own maps. And therefore, lacking logistical coordination, it made sense that most people would have a habit of basically inheriting something. Furthermore, if people were making their own map, it would be likely to just create fragmentation and chaos, because they would do it in isolation relative, and it would just be kind of psychosis, right? But now you have the ability to do it when you come into a conversation like this. You have a position that you're bringing it in encounter with limitation. Therefore, it's a neo reading where you're maintaining internal consistency in a girdle point that actually emerges the new complexity that you bring into it. And if you experience that as beautiful, then you will have the energy by which to handle that compounding complexity. And the global connected system is selecting out all maps that don't have the energy of beauty, because they are exhausted into hickomoryism, isolation, not having babies, et cetera, so forth. The new environment that is globally connected, what is the quote-unquote new natural selection? You could argue it went through a time of truth. It went through a time of selecting for the good, ergo fittedness, and now it is selecting for beauty, because only beauty can create the energy necessary to handle the existential demands of global interconnectivity, which is going to require doing that work, which then you need an infrastructure. You could say the infrastructure that has connected everything together to create that kind of meta environment of the internet, it simultaneously as a spillover effect. And I've been researched. It's very interesting listening. And to the economists talk about creativity and spillover effects and et cetera, so forth. But the point is that you now have a technology that actually allows people to better coordinate doing that, which is the necessary infrastructure by which you can deal with the compounding complexity. And again, the issue is when I'm listening to these people that are basically regretting the ways that, and I'll give it to anyone who has anything to say on this fine day before closing out on this evening. When you're listening to the economist Darren, or all of these people talking about we're so sorry that globalization and liberalism ignored people's stories, that it overlooked the importance of culture and religion in people's lives, but we're going to do better this time. We're going to make space for it. Just don't bring your views about marriage into it. Just don't bring your perspectives on feminism. And those are precisely things holding together the socio-psycho-technology by which people handle compounding complexity as religion. Just means you're going to repeat forever. What we need to think is precisely how to create the conditions of possibility by which people, in encountering otherness, experience beauty and therefore experience a gain of energy and inspiration that would thus not make them feel so tired that they could actually then, because it's only going to get more complex and overwhelming with AI and et cetera, that if you don't have beauty, you're just going to be burned out all the time. And it starts in marriage. It starts in friendship. It starts in relationship. It starts in those places, which again, because you are fundamentally in that situation, say in a marriage or an Aristotelian friendship, as we were talking about, you are dealing with the possibility of having knowledge of a person or yourself or a situation that can be different from how other people see it. And that allows a possibility of when everyone else is seeing you as incorrect, but you're actually experiencing that, no, the person is in the right, that they're right, but actually they're being seen as wrong, but actually they're correct because they're part of a higher virtue. That creates an intimacy. Knowing a person would appear heretical as such, that is an experience of the revelation of the possibility of beauty that then actually has a call on your life to do that, which then spreads that mode of being, of which is the only way to address the energy demands existentially of the globally connected world. Or we're all just going to be selected out. Like that's basically my claim. And Mr. Jai, we were talking about a bunch of different fun things. I'll throw it to Ms. Aspasia here. The claim is global connectivity is an environment that will select out all worldviews that don't generate beauty because they won't have the energy to sustain the existential and psychological demands of global interconnectivity. And that's happening now. That's part of the Hickoryism. That's part of the collapse of birth rates. That's part of the collapse of isolationism, because if you're not having babies, you're selected out. That's just basic evolutionary kind of thinking, right? And so and if you're not making friends, then your legacy is not carrying. It doesn't just have to be babies. It could be the meme of the worldview, right? Obviously. So, but those things are going to be selected out. And so versions of Christianity that don't have beauty will be selected out. Versions of atheism, versions of capitalism, every single ideological structure that is incapable of realizing beauty, as Mr. Jockin has taught on Parallax and talks about very often, every single ideological structure that proves unable to have beauty or a version of beauty in of itself, and so it goes with relationships, marriages, etc., so forth, they will all be energetically selected out. That's where we are. Let me give it to Aspasia.
I'll be quick, and this is a little bit silly, but I'm smiling. It's good. We'll get ready. I'm smiling because as I'm listening to this, I am typing out like a little speech that my 6-year-old wrote for school about potions. And like you're talking about kind of dealing with complexity and writing your own Bible. And I'm writing out this thing that she scrawled about making potions from different things helps me to learn about things like what floats and what doesn't float, and how we can combine colors to make new colors. Making potions is not just fun, it also teaches me about science and art. And I'm just thinking about how that relates to what we're talking about here, like the willingness to sort of, I know it's not the same as potions, but the willingness to experiment and put different things together, but to always be reflective on the process. Like, I don't know, it seems so basic, but it seems like something that's just really lost. You know, when I work with people, the idea that there's not necessarily something wrong if they're having a hard time in a relationship, you know, like you're supposed to face it together. It's lost. it's lost these days. Everyone wants sort of a quick answer. They want things to be smooth. They want things to be easy. They don't want to, these are big generalizations, I know. They don't want to reflect on what's the contribution I'm making to this problem. And these are all things that have already been said, but it's just, yeah, I'm writing about potions and mixing glitter and flower petals together and shells, and it just seems to be relevant to what we're talking about. So I thought I would share it.
No, absolutely. We all have to make our potions.
6:30 in the morning, so like I'm thinking about potions, so not much else.
And again, for you to come at the time of day that it is both you and Clayton, you are saints. And yeah, there's something about that mixing. Like, again, we don't know, if I just use Christianity as we don't know what mixture of Christianity is most fitting by which to generate beauty and to experience beauty and thus fittedness, and what relationality. So there's an experimentation. There's a certain trial and error. There's a certain, what reading of Hegel, what reading of Hume is that which is best to contribute toward the experience of beauty? What sort of commitments or ways of organizing people in real life or online like we're doing? Which of those structures are best for generating people of virtue by which they can have the beautiful? Because keep in mind, I've not emphasized it here so far, the beautiful, as Jockin has talked about in his class, if we combine it with the sublime and not separated, the beauty is terrifying when you first encounter it. The strike of joy, the judgment of joy, right? So it's not merely beautiful as in it brings a challenge with it. And so what potions, what mixtures of qualities, what ways of interaction are actually that of which are best suited for experiencing beauty, without which you will suffer auto-cannibalism under the pressures of global pluralism and global interconnectivity. The existential demands are too high. The demands of compounding complexity are too high. You will be selected out. And like, it just makes me think, like Jockin at the last, and I didn't finish it yet, but I think Javier just said, what's the difference between a dam? Oh, and it was something else he was saying with water, where a dam is standing, but something that water runs through. Mr. Jockin, what was that he was mentioning? I was really enjoying that discussion. Canal, that's it, a canal. Yeah, that was beautiful. Not to jump, I'm sorry, forgive me. That was lovely because there's an idea that maybe there's a difference between a dam, which has this kind of quality of a standing reserve that doesn't know its end, this kind of energy that doesn't know what it's going to go for, where a canal seems to be a technology that doesn't so much impede upon the thisness of nature, or the theme, as I know y'all were talking about, right? Well, what's the difference between a canal and a dam? At what point does a dam become a canal? At what, et cetera, right? You could argue we don't know. So you have to keep kind of experimenting, keep trying until you find something that goes, oh, this is a technology that doesn't get in the way of the theme of the water, for example, or it doesn't get in the way of that. But we don't know ahead of time. So you have to keep experimenting and you have to keep trying, right? So likewise, what relationship with global pluralism, interconnectivity, the internet, et cetera. And if anyone has any final things to say on this fine day before I jump here, I've really enjoyed it immensely. And Mr. Jockin, I know you're coming by. We're looking forward to it very much. C Money is amazing. He's going to come as well. So we're really, really excited. So, we don't know how to make, like, what the relationship is with the internet or global connectivity by which to make it not a dam, but a canal, if I use that language that Javier was putting forth. No one knows ahead of time. And furthermore, here's the other trick. We don't know which maps or what versions of which maps are best suited by which to create a canal, per se, or to be a canal, right? The argument that I think is being suggested is, because then the question is, okay, well, what would you make it for? Like, what would be the standard by which you would have reason to believe that this map is most likely a canal, or this use of technology is most likely a canal versus not? The presence of beauty. Because without that, you're going to be selected out by the energy demands. Beauty creates energy. Beauty friggin' creates energy. And you could argue, if you want to get, you could argue that fundamentally economics is all about energy. I think value is created by the dialectic between Miklowski and Smil, energy and ideas, ergo energy and creativity. And you could argue rationality at its most fundamental level is a relationality with energy. Like, what creates energy and what does not. And it kind of loses sight of that, and you have to regain it via non-rationality, et cetera, and so forth. But the point is that the energetic role of beauty, especially is in a world that has higher energy demands, like there's all this talk about AI having these high energy demands. Well, the argument is that it applies existentially as well. There's higher ontological and existential energy demands, right? Beauty is the only thing that addresses that. The good is not enough. The true is not enough. It has to be the beautiful, which sublates those and includes those. Or else the collective subconscious that is unleashed upon us is simply going to destroy us. So the challenge is high, but, you know, one can rise to its occasion, be prepared. But with that, I'll run.